During my first year of law school, I was once arguing with a philosophy PhD about legal policy, when in the midst of our argument, she said, "A lot of people a lot smarter than you have supported my position." To which I responded, "I might not be a philosopher, but I thought you all didn't go in for ad hominem arguments." In this lecture, I'm going to alert you to two forms of argumentation: ad hominem and slippery slope arguments that are often appropriately maligned. But I'm going to argue that there are circumstances, limited circumstances, where they can be valid parts of argumentation. So they are tools that can be deployed with discretion. And you should develop the ability to identify when you hear someone else use them, as I did with the philosopher, and evaluate whether the argument is being used in one of those appropriate or inappropriate settings. A classic example of an ad hominem argument is to argue that vegetarianism is bad because Hitler was a vegetarian. The unstated and faulty premise is that somehow, because Hitler was a miscreant, everything he did was bad. Ad hominem arguments draw inferences from the quality or character of a person to judge the views or the actions of that person. A more famous and effective kind of ad hominem argument arose during the 1988 vice presidential debate, when Dan Quayle argued that he had, quote, as much experience in Congress as Jack Kennedy when he sought the presidency, unquote. His opponent, Lloyd Bentsen, responded, "Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy," unquote. Ad hominem arguments are one form of prejudgment. Instead of judging the merits of the thing itself, we judge something seemingly related as a shortcut inference of quality. Analogous forms of argument draw inferences from institutions or groups of people. For example, she's probably smart because she graduated from Harvard Law School. Or, I'll probably like this cell phone because a lot of other people like me liked it. A limited defense of ad hominem arguments, and prejudgments for that matter, is in circumstances where time is in short supply and we might want to draw probabilistic inferences, especially as a preliminary matter instead of doing the harder work of evaluating the merits of the thing itself. But I emphasize the limitedness of this defense and how often ad hominem arguments are an unworthy rhetorical trick that attempts to substitute for substantive reasons. The second type of argumentation that I turn to now is often called a slippery slope. A slippery slope argument is of the form, if this, then that, and finally that. It gains its name from the metaphor that just as it's harder to maintain traction on a slippery slope of a hill than on a place that is either flatter or has better footing, there are some arguments that are hard to maintain because their logic leads through a chain of related events eventually to an unpalatable implication. Frederick Schauer has provided a definitive analysis of slippery slope arguments in a 1985 Harvard Law Review article with this same title that, quote, exposes the foundations on which slippery slope claims must stand or fall, unquote. That article forms the basis of this lecture. Justice Stewart once dissented, "The camel's nose is in the tent," unquote, to signal a slippery slope concern that the instant outcome will ineluctably lead to a dangerous result in other cases. This kind of argument is also sometimes referred to as a foot in the door argument or the thin edge of the wedge. The song from the musical The Music Man, Trouble in River City, is an extended slippery slope argument. As Schauer points out, it was not the pool table itself that was the ultimate cause of concern, but rather the fear that the presence of a pool table would lead to other activities that were inherently harmful, such as smoking, swearing, and other forms of degradation. In law, for example, the argument is frequently heard that permitting one restriction on communication, a restriction not in itself troubling and perhaps even desirable, will increase the likelihood that subsequent courts will find that other increasingly invidious restrictions are also allowable. If the police can constitutionally stop the Nazis from marching in Skokie, Illinois, then what's to keep police from stopping other unpopular groups from marching? More recently, the slippery slope argument has been used to argue if we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, we'll have to allow gay marriage. Or if we allow civil unions, we'll have to allow same-sex marriage. In each of these contexts, the end result, metaphorically the bottom of the slope, is an undesired consequence or implication in the eyes of the person making the argument. Sometimes the argument is combined with what's called a parade of horribles, which are a sequence of undesired consequences, again to the person making the argument, as we slide down the slope. As in, if we allow same-sex marriage, we'll have to allow polygamy, incest, and ultimately, the legalization of bestiality. Paul Gewirtz has argued in his article, The Jurisprudence of Hypotheticals, that courts should give less weight to hypothetical consequences that are merely theoretical possibilities with little probability of arising in the future. You should also become adept at running slippery slope arguments both ways. For example, consider a case of whether Pawtucket, Rhode Island, should be allowed to erect a nativity scene on public property. If the court allows nativity scenes, it's only one small step to allowing organized prayers and religious services on public property. And then the next step is involvement of public officials in those services. And then official endorsement of particular religious denominations, which is exactly what the Establishment Clause was originally designed to prevent. That's one way to run the argument. But you can also run it the other way. If the court doesn't allow the nativity scene, you could fear another kind of a slippery slope. The next step is allowing the courts to prohibit any mention of religion at all, including studying the Bible as literature in schools and hanging famous religiously inspired paintings in museums. And then the courts will prohibit any public official from mentioning religion, and before long the courts will even prohibit fire and police protection of church buildings. The strength and appropriateness of a slippery slope argument turns on the plausibility that the future dangerous case will arise and on whether the future courts will have trouble distinguishing the present decision from the future variation. Schauer emphasizes that slippery slope arguments force decision makers to focus on the future implications of what they do today. Because of the precedential nature of law, slippery slope arguments are particularly important with regard to legal decision making. Other decision making processes, such as electoral politics, is more often focused on the necessity of the now, of the current moment. In the voting booth, the electorate might more easily avoid the slippery slope by just voting no to a subsequent result. But courts may have a harder time avoiding the implications of the principles underlying what they announce today.